Brandon McDaniel, and today we'll be discussing Stephen Mithen's The Singing Neanderthals, Chapter 6, Talking and Singing to Baby. And we left out from the last chapters, talking about how language and music overlapped with one another in some ways, and they were independent from one another in other ways. But neither of those things say anything about which came first, the overlapping and the independence, or what proto-language was like. So looking at how language and music develop in young infants specifically might give us some insight into which one came first. So this chapter discusses pre-linguistic children and the way that they communicate and that adults communicate with them early in life. Infants are born musicians. So we'll start with a discussion of infant-directed speech. It's also known as motherese or baby talk. And it's characterized by a higher overall pitch, a wider pitch range, longer hyper-articulated vowels and pauses. Hyper-articulated, that's what that means. Hyper-articulated vowels and pauses. Pauses, kind of like that. Shorter phrases, shorter phrases. You know, you're familiar with baby talk, that would be the kind of thing. And greater repetition, as I was just demonstrating just then. Those are all characteristic of what linguists call infant-directed speech, or IDS. Infants are interested in prosody long before they're interested in the semantics of speech, and they'll always prefer infant-directed speech to normal speech. So if you try to talk to them like an adult, they won't respond as well as if you talk to them in infant-directed speech, which has a much more musical quality than normal speech has. And infant-directed speech may be beneficial for more than just language. We know it's a first stage of language. So linguists have 4 stages of infant-directed speech that they categorize and that they put this into when children start to respond to speech and create it themselves. The first stage is that infant-directed speech will engage their attention and elicit a response. So if you want to get the kid's attention, you talk to them with IDS. 2, it modulates arousal and emotion. So if you want to modulate their emotion from being fussy to being happy, IDS is helpful with that. One of the reasons why mothers will naturally fall into it is because it just works for changing the baby's mood, which everyone knows is a more pleasant place to be. 3, it communicates the feelings and intentions of the speaker after that, to that stage, to where you're getting actual language as a communication vehicle, either of semantic content or of the feelings and interactions. We go back to past lectures and we saw how music and language are both sort of for those different kinds of things, right? The feelings on the one hand and the representational things on the other hand, whereas IDS kind of, as it's laid out here, communicates a little bit of both, feelings and intentions of the speaker. And then lastly, when you get to the last stage of IDS, you're starting to get specific patterns of intonations and pauses which facilitate natural language acquisition. There you're starting to see the children use the same phonemes of the language of the culture that they're born into, and to where they're picking up on the intonations and the pauses to start to create language themselves. Infant-directed speech is surprisingly universal. So those descriptions of how we talked about infant-directed speech earlier are universal across cultures, including the hyperarticulation, the repetition, the wide range of pitch modulation, that kind of thing. And the fact that it's present across cultures has been demonstrated experimentally. It's even been demonstrated in Western and non-Western cultures, including cultures with tone languages. One of the studies cited in the book actually talked about how mothers in China that speak in the tone language, Mandarin Chinese, that they'll actually violate the rules of their own language to conform to IDS, to whereas, it kind of changes it into nonsense for some of their words and sentences because they know the infants prefer IDS. So you start to get into some of that gibberish talk, even in Western languages, but that's because there's some universal characteristics of IDS that infants just prefer. And that's demonstrated cross-culturally. We also looked in this chapter at pet-directed speech, and there are some surprising similarities between infant-directed speech and pet-directed speech. The pitch and affect are the exact same. So when you talk to little babies and when you talk to pets, the way that the pitch of your voice changes, the pitch goes high, right? And the affect tends to be that cutesy kind of thing, right? In pets and in infants. But the hyperarticulation of vowels is less when you're talking to pets. And that's because pets will never need to learn language. So the theory is that we implicitly know that children are on their way to developing language. So we hyperarticulate the vowels of the words subconsciously to sort of act as teachers to help the children along. Whereas when we're talking to pets, we know that the pets are not going to ever learn how to speak. So we don't need to use that part of pet-directed speech because it's just not necessary. And that points to this idea that people intuitively meet the needs of their audience when they're speaking to them. They kind of intuitively know who they're talking to and what the needs of that person in terms of communication are. Very interesting. Another thing talked about in this chapter was the fact that babies are natural-born statisticians in some ways. When infants are listening to sounds coming out of the mouths of their caregivers, they're picking up on statistical patterns in the auditory stimulus. So they're hearing what are the specific kinds of sounds that are getting repeated, how are they getting repeated, in what way are they happening the most, and they start to put together what the commonalities of these sounds are, both musically and linguistically. And this is true of both musical and linguistic sound. And they tested this with experiments with streams of word and tone sequences, and it was quite a brilliant experiment where they had a series of tones that were all the same in prosody with kind of nonsense words, and they saw even if the words were total nonsense, if there were little spaces where they put repetition into the words to where they repeated in some regular fashion, even if there was no semantic content there at all, it would keep the baby's attention longer than the others. So they're picking up on things like repetition and the sort of statistical aspects of the sound. What's happening more, what's happening less, and what does that mean? Which is quite an interesting finding at that stage. And the chapter also discusses how infants have apparently more perfect pitch than adults do. We know that in adults, perfect pitch is very rare. Most musicians have relative pitch. But it says almost all musical savants do have perfect pitch. These are people who may be highly cognitively deficient in other areas, but are hyper musical savants. So, they kind of ask the question, where did this come from in the first place? And in some of these experimental studies, we see that infants have a greater degree of perfect pitch than adults and gradually lose it. And the specifics of the methodologies you can read in the chapter. But the hypothesis for why this is that perfect pitch, if it's retained for too long, may interfere with language learning in Western languages. There's a lot more input coming in to languages than just pitch. So if we hyper-focus on pitch, then we don't get the other organizing principles of the language. So sometimes the theory is that that infants will hone in on the most important parts of what they're hearing and then filter out the rest. So gradually losing that perfect pitch or that focus on specific pitch information for a holistic sort of linguistic picture. But again, same reason why speakers of tone languages sometimes have higher instances of perfect pitch, because for those languages, pitch is an important semantic factor. So they'll tend to retain that since they're getting that from a very early age, that pitch is something that they should be paying attention to because there's regularity in what they're experiencing. So this might be one reason why musical training is especially beneficial between the ages of 3 and 6, because after 3, it's where you're starting to get the language skill, but the perfect pitch skill may not have completely gone away yet to where they're kind of fading it out. So if you can get kids to keep more of the skills that they had in infancy, and so that they're not pruned as they get older, then they may be able to keep more perfect pitch skill, and that be maybe one way to train children in perfect pitch during that critical period. There was other research as well that looked into the benefits of singing to infants. Studies show that babies will respond quicker and longer to singing than to speech from their mothers. They played recordings of their mothers speaking and singing, and the babies that heard the singing paid attention much longer and responded much quicker for that. And we see there are some other benefits health-wise to mothers singing to their children, aside from just increasing their musical talent, which we see at that critical period. But singing also is shown to improve babies' sucking ability. So babies that are sort of malnourished when they're young and that need a better ability to draw milk, it improves that. It's shown to stabilize their oxygen levels, and it improves the sense of well-being and connection with their mother. And Sandra Treehub ran one of these studies where she was asking mothers if they sang to their kids, and out of a sample size of 100, every single mother did. So it's a very common phenomenon of mothers singing to their infants. But we know that the more singing there is, the more of these benefits that we get for the infants. And that's the majority of information in Chapter 6, or at least the key points, as best I can tell. Thank you very much.